Okay, so it's, yeah, and it's recording now. All right, thank you very, very much. Okay, have a good evening. Bye. Wait a second, Donna. Wendy, are you there?
Mr. Richardson and thank him for his participation. I'm looking forward to an interesting evening here, and here's how I think we should proceed. Marilyn Rubin is going to introduce Mr. Richardson and engage him in a dialogue about our topic for the evening, the history of the Black community in this area and its relationship to the Jewish community. Marilyn is an associate of Mr. Richardson and has known him for some time. Marilyn and her husband, Michael, were among the founders of Shomrei Torah many, many decades ago. I won't say how many decades.
I promised you wouldn't say. Right.
Marilyn is a distinguished research associate at Rutgers, and she's formerly a professor at John Jay College in New York City. All of Marilyn's children and her grandchildren were B'nai Mitzvot right here at Shomrei Torah. After Marilyn and Mr. Richardson have engaged in dialogue for a while, Mr. Richardson will remain here and take questions from the people who have Zoomed in. Norman Klein will moderate that part of the evening. Norman is the chairperson of our Adult Ed Committee. And Norman, congratulations on doing a good job for us and getting the Adult Ed Committee back up and running. And at some point, I really hope we hear from Rabbi Mark with his insights into the subject. So Marilyn, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Henry. And Henry and I agreed not to talk about how long we know each other, because I know him longer than I know Mike. So it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Mr. Jimmy Richardson to Shomrei Torah. Mr. Richardson and I met a number of years ago at a meeting of the Jewish Historical Society of North Jersey when he was speaking about the person who was being honored, Richard Bolton. Since then, we've had many conversations on the topic of race in the United States, especially in Paterson. Over my many decades as a professor at John Jay College and now at Rutgers, I've worked with many experts on the African American community. None have surpassed Mr. Richardson's knowledge of the history of African Americans in Paterson. I'm sure you will feel the same way once you've heard him speak. It's going to be a treat. I will ask Mr. Richardson several questions, and after he and I are through, we will open the floor to questions from all of you. So welcome, Mr. Richardson. And after all this time, is it okay if I call you Jimmy? You're on mute.
Is that better? Shalom, everyone.
Shalom.
Again, my name is Jimmy Richardson, and I am a native son of Paterson, New Jersey. And my interest is in the African American presence in Paterson. So I'll let Marilyn answer questions. And good evening, everyone. I should say that also.
Yes, and again, thank you for joining us tonight. So the first question I would ask you to address is, what is the history of the Black community in Paterson and the area? What are its origins?
Okay. The origins of the African American community in Paterson really can be traced back to the 1804 gradual emancipation. And what that gradual emancipation said is any child born after July 4th, 1804, men would have to work to the age of 25 and women to the age of 21. And after about 1830, you see the occupation of Paterson's first free African Americans along an area along the Passaic River dubbed the African Shore. It was dubbed the African Shore because most of the newly freed citizens were from either the west coast of Africa or from the Caribbean. Around 1834, you see the establishment of the first African American church, and it was called the Godwin Street AME Zion Church. And for those who may not know the difference, there is an AME and an AME Zion. Now the difference is the actual denominations are very similar. It's just that the founders are different. AME is founded by Richard Allen out of Philadelphia. AME Zion is founded by James Varick out of New York. Actually, he's from New York. I'll say it like that. And that church had a small congregation of not more than about 6 people, and it of course it grew. It stayed there and became the centerpiece for the African American community from 1834 until 1864, when the first AME church was founded. The African Shore is a very important part of the city of Paterson as it relates to the African American community. There have been 12 churches that get their founding start in this area. And let me describe the area. The area of the African Shore starts at the West Broadway Street Bridge, goes all the way down to the Lafayette Street Bridge and Straight Street, down Straight Street, back down Straight Street to Broadway, and Broadway to Main Street and back to the river. That is what is considered the African Shore District. Now, of course, what is so interesting, that name had really faded from the African American community as well as the Paterson community for up until about maybe 7 years ago, when I started doing more research and brought that name back to the surface or back to the recollection of people who may have known what I was talking about. So we have those 12 churches. And matter of fact, all 12 of those churches still exist. Again, the first one being founded in 1834, and the last one being founded in 1960. Um, the African shore is also very important because of the fact in 2011, as a result of Hurricane Irene, President Obama comes to the city of Paterson. Oh, let me back up. I don't want to get to that yet. Another part of the African shore that makes it so important is because of the Underground Railroad is in the African Shore District. And it really starts around 1839 with the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded by William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. By 1841, there were 1,200 chapters of the American Anti-Slavery Society on the East Coast of the United States, because of course the West Coast had not been settled. And Paterson having a chapter. Now, what is so interesting about the Paterson chapter of the Anti-Slavery Society is that it had an executive committee, and then it had its members. Now, I need to explain this way because for years I had got it confused. You can't confuse, don't confuse the Anti-Slavery Society with the Underground Railroad, even though they are connected together. They are of the same blood, but different. The Anti-Slavery Society really deals with legislation, laws, and all those kind of things that help the abolition, that really help in the abolition of slavery. The Underground Railroad is an agency, and I'm calling it that, by which it moves people from place to place. So in Paterson, you have an executive committee, and I'll explain to you some of those guys on the executive committee, and you have the regular membership. Now, what is so really important also is in many other places in the country, the Underground Railroad is staffed by a lot of colored people, and as well as colored people, Quakers, and that thing. In Paterson, it was a little different. And I'm going to talk about it from this point of view. Paterson is uniquely poised as an Underground Railroad stop. And the reason being is because of the Industrial Revolution. There are many, matter of fact, every one of the men on in the Anti-Slavery Society were industrialists of some kind. They all owned businesses. They all were staunch abolitionists, and I won't even say staunch, but they believe heartily in the abolition of slavery. And I think that's what helps make it so unique. And I'll give you an example of some of the men that were on it. You have John Avison. John Avison was the Justice of the Peace, but he was also an insurance agent. But what makes John Avison even stand out further is because he was, for years, he was involved with public health, and he dealt with people as part of his job with the city. He dealt with which wasn't formed yet, the Board of Health, but it wasn't really established as of yet. But that was part of his job as the Justice of the Peace. Then you have Darius Wells. Darius Wells is a very interesting guy because he was a printer. But as he got older, he got away from the printing business. And as a matter of fact, he's responsible for inventing large format type, although he never got credit for it because he never patented it. But he becomes Paterson's first postmaster, and he's actually appointed by Abraham Lincoln, which is very interesting. And then, of course, you have, I said Darius Wells, you have Nathan Lane. Nathan Lane he also was involved very much in the early public service. He was an alderman. He was also a part of the public health problems in Paterson, and he was also a tax collector. 1850, he becomes the county sheriff. That's going to be very important, that 1850 and Nathan Lane, because 1850 is when the Fugitive Slave Act comes into being. So remember Nathan Lane. You also have Henry Lowe. Henry Lowe is a very, very important person in Paterson's history. He was a cotton mill owner. He was among many things, he was one of the early Republicans, actually the Whig party, and then which grew into the Republican Party. His matter of fact, his son becomes an assemblyman. So you have the Lowe family who played a very important part in Paterson, the development of Paterson. And I'll get to him again. You'll hear his name again because he plays a big part in the Civil War in terms of the enlistment of Paterson's men.
Okay, okay, Jimmy. So we have the Black community going back to the early parts of the 19th century and settling in one particular area of Paterson. Now, we hear a lot about the Great Migration, and what exactly is that, and how did people of color coming up from the South end up in Paterson?
Okay, people from the South were coming up. Of course, they were coming up as part of the Underground Railroad. But I contend that you first start seeing what's going on with the migration in 1862 with the Morrell Land Grant. And the Morrell Land Grant actually gives money for the Black HBC colleges. Now, so because of those colleges, you see the first, second, and third generation graduates looking for jobs, and they come north, and they come to the cities. By 1910 is what they would consider the beginning of the Great Migration. Now, why? And of course, it really doesn't get started good until World War I. And it doesn't get started good because in 1917, when the United States goes into, when the World War I starts, a lot of the local guys join the military, they join the Army or the Navy or the armed forces. And what happens is a labor shortage. That labor shortage forces the industrialists to seek labor. So they would send agents to the South to enlist or to hire African Americans to come north. Now in Paterson, a whole lot of them, there weren't a whole lot that came through, and if they did, they may not have stayed. But the Great Migration really takes flight in World War II, and especially in 1941, where Theodore Roosevelt signs an executive order, an executive order 8802, which is a discrimination executive order, which forces any companies doing business with doing business with the armed forces. It forces them to hire African Americans, Jews. It forces them to hire everybody because of out of discrimination. So in order to get a government contract, you had to hire a lot of different kinds of people, and especially the African Americans. And that was the draw that made people come to Paterson, because of that executive order. The second thing about the Great Migration that makes it so important is the fact that in 1948, when President Truman signs another executive order desegregating the armed forces. Now, what is very interesting about that, we always think of desegregation as being just for African Americans, but guess what? It was for Jews too. Because the military didn't want Jews, because of what was going on in Europe, they felt that, they didn't want, the Jews were discriminated also. So it became a very magnetic place to come to Paterson because of the desegregation of the military. After they got out, most African Americans came to Paterson, not most, a lot of African Americans came to Paterson or returned home to Paterson.
Okay, thank you. And so you talked then about sort of the push and pull factors that brought African Americans out of the South to places like Paterson. What was going on in the South that was pushing people out and sending them to places like Paterson?
In the deep, well, not even the deep South, but in the South, the push and pull factor is this. The push factor has to do with Jim Crow, and people were being decriminalized. They were being beaten, hung, and everything that goes with Jim Crow. And that was forced, and in addition to housing, in addition to jobs, in addition to just segregation and all the things that you hear about that goes with living African Americans living in the South. Now, with that happening, that was the push factor. They wanted to leave the South because of discrimination and everything that goes along with it. Of course, you see the rise of the Klan. You most certainly see the rise of the Klan around the turn of the 20th century when President what's his name? You know his name from
Wilson.
yeah, President Wilson. You most certainly see the rise of the Klan during President Wilson's administration, and especially after the movie that was premiered at the White House, Birth of a Nation. And for those who may not have known, Paterson would have been the headquarters for the Leif Erikson part of the Ku Klux Klan. In 1920, they burned 3 crosses on top of the Garrett Mountains Lookout. And it didn't affect the African American community. And the reason why, there were only, in 1920, there were only 1,500 African American families in Paterson. That cross burning was really directed towards the Catholics and to the Jews. And it's a really interesting story about how they got here and how they got out. But New Jersey was growing to be a Klan state for a while. But it kind of disappeared and kind of disappeared. Not once it disappeared. There might be shadows and remnants of it down in Tom's River, and I won't even, well, in the southern parts of New Jersey, there might still be remnants of the Klan, and maybe not calling themselves Klan people, but there most certainly are remnants of that kind of faction in South Jersey.
Right, so
So the push factor, that is the push factor. They were being pushed out. The pull factor has to do with jobs and economic safety, better housing, better education, better living conditions, only to find out when they got to Paterson, it wasn't so.
why was it not so?
It wasn't so because the living conditions were so bad. They were, I remember telling you about the African shore. And I told you that the district lines were, Straight Street was the boundary line. And that boundary line separated the lower or the poorest of the African Americans with the African Americans that were becoming middle class. Now you say, well, what's middle class? Well, they were chauffeurs, and some of them, as a matter of fact, in 1917, there were 4 doctors, African American doctors in Paterson. You had a lot of chauffeurs, a number of chauffeurs. You had a lot of labor people, but most certainly the women were mostly domestics. But that was considered middle class versus the people below Straight Street. So that's how that goes.
So what about when we come to, through the years, we get to after World War II, and we hear a lot about in the whole country, white flight out of cities.
Okay.
What about Paterson? What went on there?
White flight really begins and really starts to show itself around the late 1950s. And as people, and especially in the Jewish community, start doing better, they'd move up and get better houses. And maybe they might still be in Paterson, but they move closer to the east side. Now, I got to say this, all Jewish people weren't wealthy. I mean, I know of a young man who lived on 18th Street, and he was just a laborer. Marilyn knows who I'm talking about. But my point for saying that is, we didn't get a chance to mention how the Jewish community and the Black community, how they really live together. And I mentioned to you before about the African shore. In 1904, you had the first one, actually it's the second Jewish synagogue in the city on Godwin Street. Now here's the ironic part. They were right next door to each other. The Godwin Street AME Zion Church, and I can't remember the temple's name. I have problems with those temples, but they were right next to each other, they were adjacent to each other. And that is in 1904. 1924, the Godwin Street AME Zion Church, they moved to Summer and Ellison Street. And it is rumored that when they moved there, they weren't wanted, and the Jewish community in that area burned the church down. They rebuilt, and it's rumored. I can't. A lot of the people who know that story are not with us anymore, and it has not ever been recorded that way. But the Jewish community lived in the Fourth Ward, and the Black community lived there, and they lived in harmony. They lived in harmony out of respect for each other. I grew up in the Fourth Ward on Governor Street. My family moved here in 1946, and the house that we bought, we know was owned by a Jewish family because all over the houses there were mezuzahs. And I used to ask, what were they? And my grandmother would tell me. Now, why my grandmother knew is because my grandmother worked for the Kesslers out of Passaic. She was a domestic. My mother's mother, she was a domestic, and so was my mother. So we got along well with the Jewish community. If there was racial tension, it never spilled over into anything other than just living together. Again, I mentioned my mother was a domestic. She worked for the Bodners, and who owned Sten Shavers, and she also worked for the Bograds. So the relationship within the Jewish community was better than you might imagine. And of course, it did change. Again, you wanted to know about white flight. How it changed is, and again, the late 50s, as they started to move out, and Paterson's Fourth Ward started getting a little rougher. As it got rougher, and it has to do with many things, and of course, it has to do with racial tension. Now, I must say this because this may be something you may have never heard. Paterson, at one point in time, used to be called Up South. There were a lot of things that were going on in Paterson in the Black community that were the same things that were going on in the South. As a matter of fact, if African American, and in those days you were colored or a Negro, if you were to walk down Broadway towards Eastside Park through the Jewish section, you had to stay on Broadway. If you got off, if you got off on the side streets, you were subject to be arrested. African Americans you could go to Eastside Park, but you had to stay on Broadway. Another part of the white flight has to do with African Americans moving into those Jewish neighborhoods as they could afford it. And as they could afford it, it became more probable that after Jewish people didn't want to live, for the neighborhood was changing. That's a better way to say it. The neighborhood was changing. And I know of one person in particular, Russell Grady, who is a businessman in Paterson. He bought a house in I think 43rd Street. Now, what year he bought it is undetermined because I haven't talked to him in a while about when, but I know he did. And I know he also had problems with his neighbors because he was African American and they were of another faith. Again, the Jewish community and the African American community in the Fourth Ward got along well. I do know of another gentleman as well as myself during the High Holy Days, going around turning lights off for Jewish families during the High Holy Days. And this gentleman that I'm speaking about, he turned 94 Tuesday. Oh, today is Tuesday. No, the 4th. I'll say it like that. The 4th of February, he turned 94. And we have talked about his he lived on Harrison Street. In addition, there was another synagogue on Harrison Street. There were only two in the Fourth Ward, one on Carroll Street, which is now Second Baptist, and the one on Harrison Street no longer exists. But he talks about cutting the lights on and off for Jewish families who respected the High Holy Days. So, and of course, everybody got along. It was not like that. Now, one of the things that helped propel or push or fueled white flight was the fact that you had during the 60s, the early part of the 60s, you had a number of different African American groups coming into Paterson. You had, and we'll break that down a little later, but you had the SCLC, where Martin Luther King was the president. You had SNCC, Southern Christian, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had the Black Panthers. You had the NAACP. You had the Fruit of Islam, which are the Muslims. Now, you have all of those. My wife says don't use factions, but I'm going to call it factions because they all had a common goal, but how they got there was different. Now, if you can imagine Paterson's African American community being pulled by all of those factions, I'm not going to tell you any stories or pull your pull your leg. I guess if I was of another nationality, I'd be ready to move too, because the tension that was building because of these organizations looking for equal rights. I mentioned to you about the NAACP. Speaking of that, a lot of people don't, and it took me a long time to find this out. There was a legendary story that the NAACP in Paterson was founded by a Jewish man. Well, come to my surprise, he was Jewish, but he's not from Paterson. His name is Henry Moskowitz, and I believe he starts the NAACP as a founding member in Chicago. But that legendary story has traveled through Paterson, and the story that I got, that he was from Paterson and he was one of the founding members. Now, I've tried to find out that information and find out if it was true or not. And I'll tell you, I have not been able to find that. Even in the Library of Congress, it doesn't speak of him specifically, but I was told that he had family here. So maybe that's what it is.
And I know if it were available, you would find it. But so what would you say the current relationship to Jewish Black communities in and around Paterson in your perspective?
If I could go back for one moment about the relationship between Blacks and Jews. Again, I said the Blacks and Jews were kind and friendly to each other. It wasn't about them at all. It was about quote unquote white people. It didn't matter whether you were Jewish, Italian, German, whatever. If you were white, that is where the racism grew and developed. It had nothing to, I won't say nothing, but I think the fact that the Jewish community they were visible because you were in the neighborhood, but it wasn't about the Jews specifically. It was about white people. Okay, now you're talking about the relationship between Jews and African Americans now. I think you gonna say something? Okay, I think that relationship is pretty much over and done with because there are not many Jewish families. There's some, but not many Jewish families like it was in between the turn of the 20th century up until the 60s. There are not many Jewish families in there, as well as Jewish organizations. Just 40 years ago, the Jewish Historic Society moved out of Barnard Hospital and moved to Fairlawn. So a lot of the YMHA is still there, but it is now a public school. So a lot of the institutions that supported the Jewish community are no longer there. I don't even know, and I'm not sure, but I am very close to saying I don't even think that there is a temple in Paterson, a Jewish temple anymore. I don't think so. And I've looked around. I mean, I've researched it as far as calling various churches and various people that I know who would know. And I don't think that there are any Jewish temples even existing in Paterson. As far as businesses are concerned, I think there are still a number of Jewish-owned businesses, but not like it was many years ago. You had Larky's, Meyer Brothers, Charles Jacobs Department. You had a number of major enterprises that supported the city and supported the African-American community. Marilyn and myself have talked about this on a number of occasions. I have been very, very fortunate to be supported by the Jewish community. Charles Jacobs, I'm a photographer by trade, gave me my first photography studio in his store. In addition to that, he bought all the photography equipment that I needed to support his advertising business. I mean, his business was retail clothing, but he had an advertising department. Now, his advertising director wasn't happy about it because he did line work. So he was not all that happy about it. Martin, not Feigl, Martin, Broadway Bank, what's his name? Anyway, he was very instrumental. I'm trying to think of his name. It'll come to me in a minute. The president of Broadway Bank is Martin Zukanik. Martin Zukanik, very, very kind to me. I did a slide presentation, a multimedia presentation at the Rotary Club. After I did that presentation, he sent for me. He literally sent for me to come to his office, and he asked me how I was doing this, who supported me, who financed this, and I told him that I did yak yak. To make a long story short, he made a phone call. Passaic County Community College hired me on the spot. And I can go on and on and on how the Jewish community has supported me in my efforts to be whatever I wanted to be. And of course, people say, well, why? Why? And I do believe, and I spoke to Marilyn about this, if you are a decent person, people, and you are active with whatever in life you do, if people see that, and in seeing that, they try to help you. I do believe that the African-American plight and the Jewish plight are on parallel, they were on parallel tracks. Same, it's not the same. The goals were, well, freedom was the goal, but for the most part, our aims are similar. How we got there is different, but you have the Holocaust, we have the international slave trade. They're not the same, but in some instance or some way, they are most certainly, the Jewish community is sympathetic to the African-American community because of their plight. And I think that they understand what we have gone through. It's unfortunate that, go ahead, Marilyn.
So this is my last question to you before we open it up. If you're saying, do you think that currently, how do you see the Black community feeling about the Jewish community now? Not necessarily only in Paterson, but in general.
That's a tough question, because I think it really depends on your relationship with people. I mean, and I say that because the Jewish community, they're not in the center cities or the inner cities like they used to be. They're in the suburbs. So it is very difficult for me as personally to answer that question because my interaction with the Jewish community is different from other people. So, but I would think, I mean, and I really can't, that's a tough one. I don't think they hate you, but I can't say exactly what their feelings may be. The reason I say it like that is because you have a new generation of people young people, who feel different about a lot of different things. I don't agree with everything that the young people are thinking about in terms of race and in terms of race and community effort, but I do think that it's a needed movement. And I'm talking about Black Lives Matter and any of the other movements that are trying to get recognition for the African-American community. But I can't really say specifically how the African-American community feels about the Jewish community today. And again, it has to do with my perspective, because there aren't many Jewish, the community is very thin. The Jewish community is very thin. And the ones that may be there left are not necessarily actively involved in any community service with African Americans.
Okay. Thank you for answering all of my questions. And I know that people who are on the phone tonight would like to ask you questions. So is it okay with you if we open it up to questions now?
Most certainly, most certainly.
Thank you.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry.
All right, there you go.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Richardson and Marilyn for this presentation, which was very informative, and we appreciate it. Let me ask, is there anybody who has a question they'd like to ask Mr. Richardson? And I would ask, since I don't think I can get all of the participants, If you want to ask a question, just call out your name.
Or you can write in the chat.
Yeah.
Or you can write it in the chat.
Carol
David.
Raymer, I have something.
Okay.
Mr. Richardson, just so you know, there's not exactly a synagogue in Paterson, except for what used to be the Jewish Federation
Yes.
Senior Apartment Building has a minyan. I don't know if it's every Shabbos, but they do meet and they do worship, I believe, there. I know for the high holidays they do, and for some Shabbat. So, you know, maybe not exactly a synagogue, but it is a place of worship for Jews in Paterson.
There's another place that is not a place of worship, but I understand that there's a Jewish Veterans Council. I believe that, and I'm not sure if they're exactly in Paterson, but I know that they have something to do with Paterson's Jewish veterans.
There's also a yeshiva in Paterson.
Right.
There's a yeshiva Gedola of Paterson that also has a minyan there, but they're there for studying. But yeah, the last synagogue that was there was Temple Emmanuel that moved from Paterson to Franklin Lakes.
A rabbi,
Yes.
Maxine Berger. My mother was the one who got this synagogue and got from Brooklyn, this rabbinical rabbinical school to go in on this shul for them to join. And she was the one who instigated this project, and it continued. And the young men used to allow her to come and join with the services on Shabbat. So I'm very happy that they continued and they're learning there. And some of them still, as I understand, still have a place, the rabbi, to live in the area on East Side Park Avenue, near the shul where the temple is.
Which temple are you talking about? Near the shul? Which one?
On Park Avenue, there's a little steeple. There's a house. Rabbi Mark can explain.
Okay.
On Park Avenue.
Okay.
Mark, do you want to ask your question? Mark Cass?
Mark Cass?
Yes, yeah. I guess, Mr. Richardson, I guess the question is, as Paterson has become significantly more culturally diverse, Muslims, a lot of, I guess, Central and South Americans, what is the near-term future of the Black community there? Is it growing? Is it prospering? Is it being, pushed aside? What's really happening?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I think there will always be a Black community in Paterson, but I think a number of things have happened. Paterson has moved from a producing city to a city that a consumer. Oh yeah, they moved from production to consuming. So there's not a lot of job opportunities other than, with the exception of the municipal services, the state services, and the federal services. There's not a lot of industry, not a lot compared to what it used to be, that the African American community and the expanding nationalities where they can go. I mean, I'll talk about the fourth ward specifically. My gosh, I am just so appalled with when I go through there about the state of the African American community. I happen to know somebody, she's 52 and she's never worked a day in her life. She's never worked. They live to do drugs. Now, I'm sorry to say that, but it's a fact of life. It's a fact. And so I do believe that there will always be an African American presence. but how we remained and what stability we will gain is really undetermined. And it's undetermined for a number of reasons. When I look at what's going on within the political arena in town, I mean, and I don't want to beat anybody up, but I think that the political arena, downtown Paterson, the city council, I think that they used to be smarter. So I do. I just think that the older African Americans are the ones who have moved on either through attrition or just not being reelected. I think that they were just smarter about how they kept the African American community together. I think they're trying now, but I think there's too much division with people just trying to hold on to their jobs. And it's almost like I'm more concerned about holding my job for the prestigious part of it than actually helping the community. Now, of course, those people that I'm talking about, and I'm not just talking about the African American community, I'm talking about the Latino community and anybody else who is not really giving of service to the community, which is what you were supposed to do. So I just think that they could be doing more. And again, how do you do more if nobody's interested in investing in the city? You have a number of new housing developments coming up. And this was just in a newspaper the other day, an online newspaper. It's a brand new development on the bottom of Hamilton Ave and Straight Street. Beautiful development, brand new. They couldn't have been in there for 6 months. 9 people arrested for selling and for selling drugs out of that new apartment building. So it is very difficult to predict or forecast what the future of the African American community will be if the people in the community are not willing to build it back up. And especially in the wards that I'm talking about. You have a lot of good people still in town, but they can't do it alone. I mean, what do you do when the guy down the street is a young man who carries a gun? What are you gonna do? I mean, you could report them, they come and get them. Next week, there's somebody else. And it's just an ongoing thing that is, I know for a fact, it is very frustrating to the community who wants to see it grow and do better. So really, to answer your question, I don't know. I don't know what the future will be for the African American community unless they've got to get the drugs out. They've got to get education back in school. And I understand you can't necessarily do the education thing right now in person because of COVID, but I think the mindset of the young people needs to be changed. Well, some of them. There are a lot of good young people who are trying to do things. And if later, if there's time, I'll tell you about a couple of organizations that are trying to do things with the young people who are actually going into the community, pulling them out of households where some of these things are happening right in front of them. Their brother and their sisters, their uncles are being shot, stabbed, murdered, or on drugs. And they're really trying to change that. But my gosh, it is something that is monumental. And I have no answers as to how it can change other than the young people, their mindset's got to change. How that happens, I don't know.
All right. Elise, do you want to ask your question?
Actually, hi, Jimmy. It's
Hi.
Elise Paterson. How you doing?
I'm fine, thanks.
I wanted to just follow up real quick on this last question in terms of, education, et cetera. How do you recommend getting, the young people more inspired about the history of Paterson in order to kind of, have more pride in the city and want to build it back up? Paterson has such a rich history, but I'm wondering if a lot of children in the African-American community see themselves in that history. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations on what to teach them, what to present to them.
I think you said it yourself. The key word is they don't see themselves. They don't see any reputation outside of the politicians. There really is, and their school teachers, and of course the athletes. Outside of that, there's not a lot of role models. And I shouldn't say it there. I'm sure there are. If you go to church, your pastor's a role model. I'm sure that your Sunday school teacher is a role model. But for the most part, their interest is it's harder to hold their interest. Now, you asked one of the ways that I do it. Every year I do, and I'm doing more and more things. Every year I do a Black History Month program. And I try to do a Black History, I mean, it's not like other institutions where they do a Black History program, they go to honor various people, but you got to buy a ticket. I don't. My program is normally packed to the rafters with people who I celebrate from the community. I don't do a lot of talking about Martin Luther King and all of the other well-known African Americans. I try to celebrate our own in the community because they know them. Here's an example. I try to take baby steps. On tomorrow I've been working with the Veterans Administration. And as an example of how do you do things, you have to get people's attention first. And tomorrow I'm going to do a flag raising at Hayden Park, Hayden Heights. It is a park that honors the honored dead from the armed forces. It is the first time that African American flag would be flown there. And the Veterans Council agrees with me. This is a small step to being recognized. I think African Americans have to be recognized in places that they haven't been. Yeah, we know that they're in the armed forces, but how do you recognize them after the fact? And so I do little things like that. Of course, Elise knows I have been able to landmark five churches, several of them being Jewish synagogues, and they're African American congregations now. And in landmarking them, it is bringing recognition to the church, the building, the church, the building, and the historic content that comes with it. I'll give you another example. And sometimes I'm really upset. Not upset. I'm really disappointed. Auburn and Governor, or Earl Auburn and Broadway, I had renamed Freedom Boulevard. Now, on the day that was renamed, it was on the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. And you're talking about how do you educate people? How do you bring their attention to it? It was nice. And who I invited Mayor Pat Kramer and a number of other Paterson dignitaries. And one who will go nameless for the moment. He says, "Why would you invite Pat Kramer? You know what he did to us during the 60s?" And I said, wait a minute. I'm not really into what you think he did. I said, the reason I invited him is because I want to hear his side of the story. I want to hear what he did, what he didn't do, or what, and I wasn't trying to put him on the spot. Pat Kramer is very eloquent. He answered my question. He answered the public's question. And what I wanted him to do was put to rest whatever people may have thought about him. Those are the kind of things that I do to get the young people's interest. Again, I named Auburn Street Freedom Boulevard. It is a ceremonial name. Now, people may think I know for a fact that they think it's named for Martin Luther King. It's not entirely. It is named for 3 white men and 3 Black people. The first being Francis Butler, who gave up his congregation to fight in the Union Army. And he was the pastor of the First Congregational Presbyterian Church, Auburn Street. Hugh Irish, who was a famous Patersonian who was killed at Antietam. He was killed in Antietam. And you also have Charles Danforth, which the library is named for. These are all white. Oh, and Henry Lowe. Henry Lowe lived on the corner of Auburn and Broadway. Now, why I bring these guys' names? Because they were all involved in the first civil rights movement, which is the Underground Railroad. Now, the other 3 people who are African American is Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Frederick Lagarde. All of them I have a mix of people who should be honored for their work as civil rights leaders, even though it's in various centuries and in various parts of the civil rights movement. And there was a young lady who works at the library, and I said to her, I said, "Do you know why that's called Freedom Boulevard?" She didn't even know it was called Freedom Boulevard. Now, let me explain. She works in the library. And those are some of the things that I am confronted with as a public or as a public historian who has a strong interest in the African American community. I try to bring programs and I try to bring things that will bring young people to the history. I try to work with the parking authority to try and this has to do with tourism also. I wanted the parking authority to sponsor a summer program by which we would bring young people and I would teach them their history, what I know, as much as I know, to these young people by which we can start doing African American tours. So one person might learn this part, another person learn this, but I can't get them to sit down long enough to entertain it. Now, it becomes a problem for me because then they want to complain the young people don't have anything to do. I'm giving them something to do, but I need your support. And if you don't support me, they're going to continue to do exactly what they do. You know, I'm actually working with the National Park to get that site, the Underground Railroad, part of the National Park Service. Now, what I love about what I'm trying to do with the Park Service, they have a number of youth programs by which we can develop the historic what do you call it? Interpretations. We can help that with young people. So those are some of the things that I would love to do to help invite, to help encourage young people. But it is very difficult when they are blindsided by television, the internet, and various things. It's very difficult. And again, I'm not an educator. You know, I have just started talking to people out loud a couple of years ago. You know, I did a lot of writing, but it's very difficult to bring people in. And I think for me, Black History Month for me is not enough. You got to have consistent things going on to attract and bring young people together. My last point, and I know Marilyn is probably saying, she's probably rubbing her head, is on 43rd Street and Veland Avenue. We're in the process of renaming that park. And those who know the area know it's called Triangle Park. And we are trying to name that park the Amistad Park. And the proposal that I wrote was transforming a park to fit the needs of a changing community. And I talked about the history of that park. And nobody even knew that Veland Avenue was called Buttermilk Lane. And that park was donated to the city by Garrett Hobart. And you start talking about the history. Now, when I got the young people in front of me and they're captive, oh my gosh, I can keep them. But how do you get them? How do you get them? I've been talking to some people up in Connecticut because that is where a replica of the Amistad is done. And I'm trying to model some of the things that I'd like to do after what they have already done. Now, you know, I'm not Superman. I'm getting old too. I can't do it all on my own. But if I can introduce it, if I can introduce it and really help get it together, I think it will be, I know that it will be something that will attract young people. 2 weeks ago, the governor just signed a bill legislating $400,000 to the Amistad Commission to strengthen the Amistad Commission. It's a bill to strengthen the Amistad Commission by investing $400,000 to the commission. Now, here's the problem. $400,000 sounds like a lot of money to me and you, but when you start doing statewide programming, that's a drop in the bucket. And I'm trying to get the guys who are working on this Amistad thing to get up, and you got to do your curriculum and get your foot into it, because if you don't, the big dogs are going to get all the money, and you're going to be still walking around again saying, what do I do? How do I do it? The money's gone. And my point is, you got to get everybody up working for the benefit of the young people, which will eventually strengthen the community. And I hope I haven't been too long with that answer. I know I'm long-winded, but I hope I answered your question. Thanks.
If I can ask a question about something you mentioned before. You indicated that Paterson was a stop on the Underground Railroad.
Yes, sir.
Does that building still exist? Has it
No,
been
it doesn't.
marked in any way?
No, it doesn't. What happened in the The last building that really represented that history of the Underground Railroad was knocked down in 1983. And guess what stands up there now? Wendy's. The Wendy's restaurant is there now. And of course, because I've been working on it for a long time, I have all the documentation where people have tried to get them not to knock it down. I will forward the video to Marilyn, and maybe she will forward it to you. I did a video of the demolition. And when you hear the story, you will, I think, the fact that it's gone, but I think you have a deeper appreciation of why they shouldn't knock down historic buildings, be it black, white, or zebra stripe. If it's got some kind of historic significance, it should remain. Now, in 2014, a monument, a statue honoring two men, Joseph P. Huntoon, who was white from Montpelier, Vermont. He owned a coffee and spice mill or factory on the corner of Broadway and Bridge Street. And his house was Near's Drugstore, which was knocked down in '83. All that stuff is gone. And the statue that is there is in honor of him and William Van Rensselaer. Now, I gotta tell you, his descendants still live here in Paterson. They're still here. And what happens is the bond is formed and created by those two men to move people through Paterson's Underground Railroad. But the only thing that is still, the only artifact that still exists in Paterson with the Underground Railroad is in Lambert's Castle. It is it's called the Tin Dog. And it is for the bigger part of the answer is, it's actually an awning that's not an awning, but a sign, or it's not a sign, it's a marker that Horatio Moses hung out of his store to let people know what kind of business he was in, but it became an Underground Railroad marker. And part of the reason it's hung is because most of the immigrants couldn't speak English. But that marker, that tin dog, which is about 3 feet long, stands about 2.5 feet high, and it stood above the doorway to go into his business. That is the only artifact in the city of Paterson that represents the Underground Railroad. And who knows that? Not my people. My people don't even know.
All right.
I'm
Eric,
sorry for
why?
taking so long.
No, that's okay. Eric,
Yeah,
why
can you
is-
hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi, Mr. Richardson. First of all, thank you for this very informative presentation, and thanks to the Shomrei Torah team that put this together. I've been at Shomrei Torah for, I don't know, 40 years, and this is the first time I can remember a program like this. Secondly, I want to let you know I went to college, and I was the Underground Railway was part of my college. So I'm not a part of the Paterson community. I didn't grow up in Paterson, but I grew up in two other black or nearly black ghetto environments. So in my background, my relationships with my black friends, and they were very close, was based in school. I went to integrated schools. One was in Pittsburgh. It's a long story. But I think that institution no longer exists. We're mixing between Paterson and, let's say, Wayne, or Paterson and Fairlawn can exist. So how can we build bridges among our communities and among youth? Are there other institutions? I'm going to mention one: the churches and the synagogues. Are there other institutions that can be used to foster relationships and bring people together, like we're doing tonight? I think it's incredible what we're doing tonight. Thanks for taking my question.
I think there are a couple of church organizations that are progressive enough to do this. Now, and when I say the church, you must also look at the leadership. You know, if the leadership of the church if the leader is progressive enough to host or to host something like this, I think that is where you start. But and there's no buts. That is one way, is trying to do it through the churches. But there's a number of civic organizations. Now, some of them I would not recommend, even though they've been around for 100 years, because they don't. In my opinion, some of the civic organizations have basically become ceremonial. You know, and of course, if they heard me say that, they'd probably hit me on the head. But I just think that they become ceremonial. So I think you got to reach out to the grassroots, roots organizations that really feature young people. And I think that's where you start. It may not always come out of the church, because I do believe I do believe that even the church population is growing. I mean, it's dwindling, and especially among the youth. I mean, the youth are not going to church like they used to, because the whole dynamic of the church and the family has disintegrated. So the whole church thing with the young people it's a whole different dynamic. But there are a couple of churches that do have a strong youth following with membership that were educators that could possibly help facilitate what you may want to do. And one church in particular is the First Amy Zion Church. Again, that church is the oldest African American church in the city of Paterson. But that church has a very aggressive, progressive ministry as they deal with young people. And there are a few organizations that in Paterson that want to reach out, but either don't know how, or it's in a realm that they never thought about. Now, when they talk to me, they realize that this is a workable idea. After I finish talking to people about trying to bring people together, which is what I always do and always have done. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. If you have a message, I try to bring you together. Am I doing sorry to say it about myself again, but when I do Black History programs, I bring in black and white people. One young lady said, she says to me, "Why would you bring that white man to a Black History program?" I said, "Do you know anything about what he was talking about?" She says, "No." I said, "That's why." So my point for saying that is, I think you have to reach out to a younger grassroots organizations. Again, there are a few progressive African-American churches that might be interested, and I think that's how you do it. And again, they're going to be baby steps. You're not going to jump in and turn the world around. That's not how it works. And I'm sure you even know that yourself. It's not how it works. You have to do little things a little at a time. Does that help him?
This is Maxine Berger.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to remind you that Lenny Sachs took us on our reunion, because I graduated from East Side High School in 1967, and he took us to the Great Falls, and he took us to the museum and the trains. And now I know it's built up even more with the movie theater there. And when you talked about Straight Street, it reminded me that when I was in college 40 years ago, telling my age, I worked in the post office, and I was thinking about something very important that, fortunately or unfortunately, there should be a future that young people want to go to college, but maybe there should be trade schools too, that they should be encouraged to. And also to young people like myself, we went to college and we went to school at night, and we went to work in the post office, and we also ended up going to the post office at night and worked so we could go to school during the day. And maybe there are a lot of interesting jobs like that that may help young people of all different races and help to supply money on the table that'll help with food and clothing and other things that will make it more interesting to go to school and be educated and look for other means of,
employment. I know for a fact that there are a couple of programs that go on in the Paterson public schools now, but that whole philosophy that you've talked about really started in the 1980s. And the reason why I know is because I produced a film for the Board of Education called Fast Forward. And it has to do with bringing young people to school for half a day and they go to work for half a day. But when you talk about trade schools, here's the problem with trade schools. The problem with that, I see your hand, the problem with trade schools right now is the only one that you have is Passaic Valley, Paterson Tech up in Wayne. That's the only trade school that you have. Now, when you put that together with how industry has changed. I mean, when I went to school, there was plumbing, there was electric, there was woodworking. All those trades were part of their curriculum. Those things, it's not that they are still not needed. It's just that they don't teach them anymore. They don't teach that stuff. Now, you're talking about trying to take young people to places where they can learn. I am a very good friend of Doug Doyle from WBGO FM radio. It's a jazz station. We're good friends. He does a lot of things we do a lot of things for each other in terms of broadcasting. And I asked him, would he be willing to host a group of young people and show them how the broadcasting industry works. This is something they would be interested in, because it's not like he's the national director of news programming. So he's not going to be spinning records. He's going to be talking about grammar. He's going to be talking about writing. He's going to be talking about the electronics that go on in broadcasting the news. Now, of course, right next to him is the DJ, but he's not spinning records. He's spinning CDs now. So it's a whole different thing. But my point is, I try to bring a new kind of education, not education, but a new way of looking at employment to the young people, and something that they would be interested in. I see your finger. Is that for me? There's a gentleman's finger there. Is that for me? Eric?
No, I don't know, but let me call upon Bob Gordon.
Okay.
Bob?
Yes, sir.
Unmute. Well, I'll unmute you. Okay.
Okay. I was just interested in your young people enthusiasm and trying to get them through various organizations involved and maybe trying to change their perspective. One of the things that I came up with was our alumni group, our reunion group that now meets, I guess, every 5 years or so, graduating from Eastside. Why couldn't we rely on some of those high school groups to encourage and involve some of the new younger people that you're referring to, and show them how we learned how to grow together and be together and still have an identity?
I think that's a really interesting approach. Here's what I think I heard. If you were to get your alumni together, let me say this: the only thing that has changed is how you do things, and that's through technology. You still got to learn how to read. You still got to learn how to write, although they don't know how to write cursive anymore. But my point is, some of the basics are still there. And with your alumni, maybe, and again, people who may be educators, and I don't even know if it matters what they did for a living. If you bring experience to the table, I think that is that's an admirable thing to bring to young people to hear and actually see, and for them to realize. And I tell them all the time, you know, I was a real poor student in elementary school. I was real bad, not terrible, mischievous. And because of that, I tell them, because of that, I missed out on a lot. And what I missed out on is the fact that I didn't pay attention. Now, everything that I didn't pay attention to is what I need. I was a drummer for 40 years. If you can't count, you can't play. At least not in the professional arena. You got to be able to read music. As a photographer, you couldn't do the chemistry, develop pictures and do the chemistry if you can't read. Even with music, if you can't read, you can't read the music. You can't sing it. I mean, you can memorize it, but it's not the same. And so I bring those same things to you about your alumni. They have skills. Your alumni people have skills that they're not obsolete, because it's just that they're ground level. They might not be technical, but they're ground level. And unless you can if you can't do it from the bottom, you'll never reach the top. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, am I just talking to myself?
No, you're not talking to yourself, but I see that it was sort of getting on in time.
Well,
and
Marilyn, before we terminate this, if Jimmy will just give us a few more minutes. He's been
Please.
very, you've been very patient and very accommodating, and we really appreciate it. But I'd like to call on our rabbi, Rabbi Mark.
Thank you. So, Mr. Richardson, I would add my thanks along with everybody else in appreciation for what you presented this evening. I think your assessment that here in New Jersey that the Jewish community has left the inner city is accurate. And while that went on a nationwide level, Jews have been re-urbanizing in many parts of the country. And certainly during this most recent election season, the relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community in Atlanta worked hand in hand on the senatorial election and gave hope to many in the Jewish community who would like to see improved relations between the Black community and the Jewish community. And so I guess the question I would have for you is, clearly there's interest on our part on furthering this and working together. And do you think that you could help us find a church in Paterson that would be willing to work together with us to see what kind of bridges we might build? Because I'd love to see more happening right here in northern New Jersey.
Absolutely. Now, the congregation that you're interested in working with, are they specifically in Paterson or in other parts of the state?
Well, being here in Wayne, Paterson's a good location.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you can serve as a conduit to help bring us together, that would be something that we would be appreciative of.
Have you ever heard of Buster Sores? Buster Sores was the Secretary of State under Governor Whitman. He has one of the largest Baptist churches in the state of New Jersey. And he has an extremely progressive congregation, and he's from Montclair. How you like that? He's originally from Montclair. Now that's one particular church, but it's in South Jersey. He's in Franklin. But there are a few churches right here in the area, and again, we're talking about Paterson, Passaic area. There are a few churches here in this area that I know would, and I can't say I know, but I would most certainly make the introduction, and I'd lay the groundwork by which you could walk through the door. I most certainly could do that for you, and we could talk later, Rabbi. And I love saying that word, Rabbi. It's not like saying Reverend. It's different. But I would love to make those introductions for you. I think it may go a long way for me to make the introduction, because the people I would be bringing you to, they know my reputation, they know what I do, and they know how entrenched I am into the city of Paterson's African American history. So I'd love to make that introduction for you.
Oh, much appreciated.
Wendy, do you have something you wanted to ask?
Who are you talking to?
Wendy.
Wendy,
Oh.
you have to unmute yourself
You're
right
on
up.
mute.
Okay. I had to step out before, so I don't know if this was discussed, but during Thanksgiving, and of course this is COVID, so it could be a little bit more extreme. I'm from Temple Beth Tikva, and as a Hebrew school project, we had heard that Paterson had about 20,000 people who were hungry. And we put together an event where we delivered 50 turkeys and 50 Thanksgiving dinners. But the amount, when you think that we live in Wayne and you're a hop, skip, and a jump, and there are 20,000 people who are hungry, is anybody involved in that in Paterson? I mean, between listening to the hunger and then the lines that they have to wait on to get the vaccine shots, and is there nobody that is in charge or taking hold of all of this? Because that's astounding. It's absolutely astounding.
Here we go. I know of 4 churches specifically that do a feeding program. One is New Christian Tabernacle. I know that New Community Baptist Church of Love does one. I think Calvary Baptist does one. There are a number of churches, and I can put you in touch with them, do a feeding program. But I'm going to give you a tip. I do a feeding program, and I've been doing it for about 5 years. And I was doing it in Paterson. You know, sometimes people are they're too smart for their own well-being. They're too smart. Now I happen to deal with a food purveyor, and he does fresh fruits and vegetables. Now I only do one church now, and it's in Newark, and that's because I live in Hillside, which is a stone's throw from Hillside. It's connecting cities. And anyway, and I'm going to give you a tip about what you can do, how you do it, and may not even cost you a lot of money. This particular company that I deal with, and I feed these people twice a month. I go and he gives me as much as my car can hold every time I go. And some days I go twice a week. Anything that grows, they have there, and he gives me whatever I want. Down around Christmas time and Thanksgiving, I make a list, and they fill my car up. But here's my point I'm trying to make. If this is something that you think that's in your heart that you'd like to do with a church organization, I'll try and put you in touch with some organizations, some companies that may be willing to help you. You know, I mean, the one that I deal with is a pretty big one. You know, so it's a big one. But yes, there are churches, and there are little institutions or little organizations that do feeding things too. And if you didn't want to do it with the church, I know of a couple of organizations that really they're not part of the state, that deal with social services that might even be more interesting to you. You know, I mean, there are places.
Well, what I was curious about was that there aren't enough jobs for the people if they're going hungry. And yet you have these suggestions that are so good to bring the younger people into the work field or see opportunities for even older people. And then they're resisting that. If I didn't understand that correctly, that's what I thought you said.
Yeah, and you're right about how you heard me. You know, you've heard that expression, you could bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. That's how people are. People are crazy. I mean, and I can get excited about people are nuts. You know, let me say this about the poor and the hungry. Now, you have to respect them also. They're not going to eat garbage. That's number one. When it comes to jobs and those kind of things, you know, first and foremost, you got to want to work. That may sound crazy. You know, you're hungry and you want to feed your children, but you got to want to work. And you may be surprised and you may not. How many people, they don't even want to work. They want to stay where they are, which is part of what some of the senators and what the senators are talking about. Why would you give people money? The more you give them, the more incentive they have not to work. But I think you got to give people a hand up in any way you can. But again, I think you got to want to help yourself. I mean, when I was saying about respecting people who may not have much, you know, even doing my feeding program, you know, the ones that I do. And again, I'm just one person. You know, I'm one person that feeds about maybe 150 people a month. And I do that on I'm not going to just distribute it. I'll be the liaison between the company and actually delivering it to you. But I'm not going to stand here and hand it out. You know, I think and it's not that my work is done. It's just that everybody's got to do their part. Now, here we go. When I said about respecting people, sometimes when they'll give me a case of something, and at the bottom of the box, it might be going bad. You know, it might be going bad. You know, if they see that, now they don't want it. Or you go down the street and you see what you gave them in the garbage. Rather than leave, if you don't want it, don't take it. But there's people, and it seems like the less they have, the more picky they are. You know, and I tell them straight up, if you wanted to look like that, then you probably need to go to ShopRite and pay for it. You know, and there's nothing wrong with it. It may have some of it. I mean, when I say some of it, if you get a case and there might be a couple of blemished apples. Wait a minute, and I tell them, I said, what do you think the guys at ShopRite are doing when they put their stuff on the racks? They're going through it, pulling the dead leaves off because it's right from the farm. But for some people, they can't seem to understand it. They think they come to the feeding program, everything is supposed to be perfect like they're in the store. And you know, I'm sorry to say it, but it seems like the poorer you are, the more fussy people are. But I also realize that you have to respect people. You know, people won't respect just because I don't have a job and I'm hungry is no reason to give me garbage. You know, so I try to make sure that they get good food, and I'm hoping that I hope that's helping to clarify what you asked. I know that I go around sometime, but I'm hoping that helps clarify some of your interest in helping. If that's what you want to do in terms of food, I'll put you in touch with somebody or an organization that would welcome your donation.
Mr. Richardson, can
Yes, sir.
I ask you to answer one more question?
Absolutely,
I know,
many questions
I
as
know
you
the
want.
time is moving on. There's a question from Lisa Zevin. Lisa?
Yeah, actually, it was my mom's. She put it in to me by mistake instead of everyone, so she can ask it.
Okay.
Okay.
My
Yes,
question, I'm not from that area. I used to live up in northern New Jersey. I'm down in North Carolina. I'm Lisa's mom. And so I'm down in North Carolina. But I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there any kind of youth center for these kids, for programs when they can begin to group together, where they are taught perhaps how to dance or how to do their photography or how to do some gymnastics, things that get them active, get them in groups together, even get them a little bit competitive with each other, but not in an aggressive way. And I think about my father-in-law came to this country as a young child and lived on the Lower East Side. And they had something called the Henry Street Settlement House.
It's very popular.
So, you know, I don't know if that exists today, but it was an area where they could also learn other skills and basically learn the language and writing skills. Children love to tell stories. They can start by talking stories and having somebody tell them to write it down, you know, things that they've experienced. Even before they know how to read and write, they tell you stories. So if somebody could read to them, or different programs where people, seniors like myself, who are not employed gainfully anymore, but would like to do stuff, you know, things like this, to tap into the people and communities that other grandma, grandpas who have skills and training that they would like to share with other children.
Well, here in Pat, I got to explain this to you about me. I don't live in Paterson anymore, but all my work is concentrated in Paterson. So I don't know all of the youth organizations that might exist, but the bigger ones is the YMCA. They still have a building there, and I don't know what all they do, but I know, and as an example, my brother was a coach for years that taught basketball. He taught basketball, and of course, there's the Boys and Girls Club. They're still in Paterson. They've got a pretty nice building. They're still there, and I know that some churches they all have youth groups, but what they do, I don't know. I don't know entirely all the things that these youth groups do in these churches. So yeah, there are some activities for young people to do, but how involved? And here's the sad part: most of the church organizations, they have willing hearts and willing spirits, but what happens is it is mostly limited to their congregation. Now you say, well, you know, and how do you go out and get young people if they won't come? So what happens is, even though what they have is accessible, it is normally for their congregation, and it really doesn't reach out. Even though it's available to them, let's put it like this, they don't sell it that way. You know, does that make sense? They don't sell it that way. They basically sell it to their congregation. You have a youth program, you know, they expect their youth to come, but they don't always draw from the outside.
I'm talking about a community center that isn't church related necessarily, but community related.
Well, you've got the Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah.
And the Y. Those are the only
And-
two. But I don't know what they do in there in terms of their curriculum or activities. I'm not sure exactly what they do. I haven't been in those buildings in years, or even talked to any of the administrators. So I don't know what they do. But those are two organizations that are pretty big that are still here.
Norman, our president has his hand up.
I'm sorry. I missed what you said.
Our president has his hand up.
Oh, okay. I didn't see it, but go ahead.
One of the participants has indicated that as a result of the COVID, a lot of the in-person activities that may have formerly existed at the Y and the Boys Club have probably stopped, or at least are very limited now because of the restrictions on people getting together. So, but you know, Mr. Richardson, if there are people in the group like Eric or Bob Gordon who want to, let's say, institutionalize a relationship, or like as the rabbi suggested, to formalize a relationship between our community and a community group in Paterson, can we call on you to facilitate that? And
Absolutely.
how would we get in touch with you? Just through Marilyn?
Through, you know, well, after this is over, Marilyn has my information, and I know that she will share it with you. You know, I don't necessarily have to give it to you over the air now, but you give it to Marilyn, and we'll make contact that way, and then we'll do it one-on-one, me and you or whoever. Or it could be a conference call. But for the most part, your first initial connection will be through Marilyn, and she'll hook it up for us. But you're talking about because of COVID and the isolation that the young people do. My gosh, when I look at us tonight, this is something that may not have happened if not been for COVID. So here's my point. There's a commercial about this new device for exercising where it is interactive, where you jumping around in a mirror and you're doing all these. You know, I think that we all have an incredible imagination, and I think that the technology is here to execute anything that your imagination will allow you to do. And I think you sometimes just have to think out of the box. And when you think out of the box, sometimes you realize that everybody else has got the same box, they just never opened it. So I don't think that COVID in its entirety is a handicap. And of course, young people are on their computers or on their computers all day, but they're doing something that some of them don't want to do. You give them something they want to, you give them something that they want to do, you'll never get them off. So I just think that you have to think a little differently. I try to think differently in everything I do and take advantage of things that people overlook. It's right in front of you, but they overlook it. And in overlooking it, it becomes an asset for me because now I can build on it and expand on it. And I think that's how you have to look at what it is that you want to do. Sometimes it is not always, and I'm not saying, Wendy, I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm saying that you should, but sometimes it's not always food. It's not always food or those kind of things. And it's not always money. I talk to Marilyn a lot, and I get a lot of things from various companies, and I tell them right up front, I don't want the money. I'd rather have your goods, and in doing that, they actually give me more than if I would have had to pay for it, because they realize that I'm not in it for the money. I'm in it for and I can't even say the experience, because God knows I got enough of that, but I'm in it to help other people. So I do think a little differently in how to maneuver and how to move my way through things. And I think that's what you have to do in terms of trying to reach out to young people. Think about something, you say, well, how could that possibly happen? Well, again, the technology is here. We just have to do it in a way that's not just accessible, but in a way that's digestible. I mean, that's what I think. I mean, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it does. On that note, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Richardson, and thank you, Marilyn and Henry Ramo, who helped to facilitate this, and wish you all a good night. This has been
But wait a minute. Can I say something? I don't want to let you go. I mean, you can't just leave me like that. You can't just leave me like that.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I was looking at the clock and I thought you might wish to leave. That's all.
No, I know we've probably been on long enough. There could always be a part two, because I've got a lot more to tell you, and I will explore some things and some ideas that I can share with you next time, if there will be a next time. Actually, how to maybe execute some things. I will get some contacts for you. I'll make some contacts for you and see what we can do, because I think you have willing hearts, and I think that you really want to do something. I think we are in a situation in this country that if we don't reach out to each other, guess what? We all gonna be lost. So
Here,
I'll say this in my final words. It is my job to encourage you to help me do the best that I can. And how I do that is by you asking me, what can I do? There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. You look
much.
also
Thank you very
familiar.
much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good night now.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Here.
You're welcome. Marilyn, we'll talk later.
I'm sure. Goodbye.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody wants to continue the chat, we can continue it amongst ourselves. If you like, feel free. Rabbi, would you like to open the discussion?
And, certainly if people have had enough, they can call it a night. But if the things they want to say or share, they're certainly welcome to do so.
Well, I have to tell you one thing. I was very pleasantly surprised. At one time, we had 45 participants, which, based upon what you told me about what happens historically, is an excellent turnout.
It was actually more.
Discussion was good.
It was 45 boxes, and many of them had 2 people in them.
Well, that's true. There were some with more than one person. So let's say maybe it was 50, but whatever it was, I thought it was an excellent program, and I'm glad we were able to do it. And I think some of the ideas are good ones. And if Mr. Richardson follows through with Marilyn and we get that information, maybe we can, in fact, develop some connection with a church in Paterson and do something, share something.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Henry, are you still on this call?
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
still
he is.
here.
Henry, one thing that struck me, first of all, I thought it was a fantastic presentation, and it brought a lot of us together in a way that I haven't seen before. But the thing about food and 20,000 hungry people, a lot of us know about Eva's Kitchen, but I never heard the 20,000 people statistic before. And that kind of, I don't know, it motivates me to do something. I don't know what, but we grow food in the garden, but the garden's only 3 or 4 months out of the year. So I wonder if there's something we could talk about later on about food.
That if I could just chime in, there was one very interesting aspect that Mr. Richardson brought up, and it's been like this for quite a while. And my wife Carol taught in Paterson for quite some time, back in '68 through about, I don't know, 70 something. And that is, as he pointed out, there's a drug problem, and he emphasized that in the new community that was built. And I think that's one of a major roadblock there, not only for the youngsters, but for the teenagers and older people as well. That's something hard to get around. They see easy money, they see drugs, and naturally, it's a syndrome that one never gets out of. And I think that's one of the areas that needs to be looked at as well. It's not only feeding people; it's how do you get them out of that cycle of wanting to sell drugs and just keep that thing perpetuated. That plus the education.
Well, I think getting into the drug issue is really biting off more than we can probably chew.
Not disagreeing with that, but I recall my wife when she was teaching. She taught third and fourth grade, and she was also a reading specialist. And her main thought was that if I can get these kids, forgetting about geography and all that, if I can just get these kids to learn how to read and do math and let them build up confidence within themselves, all right, they can hopefully see some other horizons other than, even back then there were drug problems. You're right. There's no way we're going to solve the drug problem, but I think a lot stems from education, and the kids had a tremendous amount of respect for her, for the simple reason is because she had a lot of respect for the kids, and she stayed up all night long until those papers were marked, and they got them the next day. And I mean, it got to the point where the kids were calling us at home.
That's right. I mean, I lived in Paterson 20 years, and my wife worked in County Tech, Passaic Tech,
right.
And 99% of the people that they were teaching, they all came from Paterson. They're all part. This was Passaic Tech, but the 95% from Paterson. And when they got there, their education is zero. I mean, she was teaching high school science and math or so, and they came in there knowing absolutely nothing. I mean, she and another person had to develop their own curriculum to be able to teach them to move up. I was right, their education and their individualism is a big problem. And no matter how we start, with any adult education or any problem, the problem that they have internally is regular education in young. They're not being taught anything. Teachers that go there don't want to teach anymore because the parents don't get involved. Tara will tell you, zero involvement.
Exactly.
Anytime that teachers have called parents to come up, I said, that's not my problem. You deal with the problem. So unless they themselves will solve the problem education, you're going to have a big problem.
And Mr. Richardson had a very, very good point as well. He said you can't keep giving money out. Granted, we need to get people out of this mess that we're in right now, but which I think is important. But he said after that, he said you can't just keep handing the money out because then they won't do anything. He said and that's the worst thing in the world. So it's a multi-pronged situation, and you can't just focus on one. It sounds like you have to hit all the buttons at one time.
Well, but I think maybe if we, depending upon what the connection is that Mr. Richardson can get for us, if we choose one area, whether it be education or food pantry of some sort, or some other kind of activity, that would be good for us to proceed with, assuming the congregation will support it.
Norman, I think that focus is the right word, and food or education, if we get a focus and people can kind of, in a sense, make it simple. Like, you know, Henry started a garden, very simple idea. And if you like to garden, and Henry, you know, I haven't been in the garden much at all, but it's simple, and it gives you a sense of achievement. So if we can keep focus, I think that's important. And Rabbi's word use of building bridges. I think focusing on building one-on-one relationships. It works. That idea is used with Israel too. I mean, if you build relationships with individuals and families, then good things can happen. So I like the word focus. I really do.
Gentlemen, I'm going to bid you adieu.
Yes.
Call it a night.
Yeah.
Thank you, whoever put this together. Thank
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all. Have a good evening, what's left of it.
Yeah.